I'm Tyson with Adventure Rig, and today we're going to be repacking wheel bearings on one of our enclosed trailers. It's a pretty simple process, but first things first, safety. Make sure that your trailer is chalked so that it's not going to move once you get a wheel off and fall onto the axle or anything like that. Next, we're going to take our bottle jack that we have, and I'm going to stick it underneath the frame right where this rear tire is to jack the rear off of the ground. Now I have a powered impact, so I can get the lug nuts off once the tire's in the air. If you don't have the power tool and you're using hand tools, you may want to loosen your lug nuts prior to jacking it in the air, because once it's in the air, the whole wheel and tire are going to want to spin. So let's stick the jack underneath the frame. All right, once I got the rear wheel off the ground, I also slid a jack stand under there just in case my jack fails, that I don't have the weight only supported by that, and I've got the jack stand also. Next, I'm going to remove the lug nuts. All right, now that we have our wheel off, we can see the brake drum, and we're going to pull this dust cover on the outside off next. I like to use a screwdriver that's really small, a flathead, and just squeeze it between the flange on it to just pry it off a little bit. All right, so now that we have the dust cover off, hopefully you'll see grease in there. If you don't, you're long overdue for repacking your wheel bearings. This is also the part that gets a little bit dirty. I like to wear rubber gloves. But I'm going to first start off by cleaning off all the excess grease that's on the outside so I can see exactly what I'm working with. Now that we have the nut cleaned up, we can kind of see exactly what we're dealing with. On this particular trailer, it's a castle nut, and I actually have a cotter pin that goes through it that I'm going to have to pull out to prevent the nut from spinning off and backing off while the trailer's going down the road. On some trailers, you may find a clamp that actually kind of goes around the nut, and those just pop off, or you may have to bend tabs to get those off so that you can access the nut and spin it off. With the cotter pin out, we can now spin the nut right off of the axle. With the nut off of the axle, we're now ready to pull the drum and slide it off. For this process, I like to put my hand on the end of it because the bearings will fall right out. You don't want them to fall on the ground and get full of crud. With the drum now off of the axle, you can see that on the back side I have a grease seal, and then on the front, it just fell out, I've got a washer that sometimes will stick to the castle nut itself when you take it off, or it'll stick to the bearing, and then obviously this right here is my bearing. So on the back side where this grease seal is, I need to pull that out. Now, most of the time when I go to pull these out, they do get pretty destroyed. You can pick up a new one from an auto parts store such as a Napa or a CarQuest. You can just take in your old one and they should be able to match it up. Or if you know the axle that you have, you can tell them that and they should be able to find it right off the axle. I like to use just a punch, and I'll slide it underneath the grease seal, and then I'll hit the back of it so that it pries the grease seal up, and it's just resting on the hub itself. And then it pops out, and I can access my bearing on the back side. At this point, I'm going to go ahead, clean out all of that old grease on the races from the front and the back, and I'm going to inspect the race. So once I get the grease off of it, I can see the race itself, and I'm looking for any kind of pitting or scratches or discoloration. If it's discolored, if it's a purple or a bluish color, that means that the bearing heated up quite a bit inside of this race, and it heated up the entire thing, which, if that's your case, well, it's a good thing you're doing this because you really didn't have any grease in there to begin with to get it that hot. And then on this side, I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same thing with cleaning it and inspecting my race. All right, with the bearings themselves, I'm going to go ahead and clean those up. And again, I'm inspecting these just like I inspected the race on the hub. I'm looking for any kind of discoloration on the bearings. And also any kind of damage that they may have, if there's any pitting on those, anything like that, you're going to want to go ahead and replace them, or if they're discolored. Again, this is something you should be able to pick up from an auto parts store. And in order to get them really clean, you can use brake cleaner and just spray them down and get all of the old grease that's in between all the bearings out pretty easily. With the bearings cleaned up, we're now ready to repack them. Now, I like to use just a wheel bearing specific grease. You just want to make sure that the grease you're using is something that can withstand the speed and the temperature that these wheel bearings may get to. I like to just use my palm when I repack them. I take a pretty generous glob of grease and just place it in my palm. And then with the new wheel bearing that's clean, I'll start on the edge of the grease, and I'm just pushing down on it and forcing the grease into the bearing. And then on the top, you'll actually see the old grease getting squeezed out of the bearing. And so as that happens, I'll just make my way across the entire bearing, just putting new grease in the entire thing. Okay, with the bearings completely greased and new gloves that are nice and clean, I'm going to go ahead and pack some grease into the hub itself so that when the bearings go in, there's a little bit of grease in there for them to ride on. With the grease packed into the hub, I'm going to put my bearings back in. One thing to note, these do have a slight cone shape to them, so they only want to go in there in one direction. And on this one, it's the cone, the skinnier part of it, is going to face down towards the ground when you insert it. With the bearings back into the hub and everything's greased up, I'm ready to install the new seal. This is a new one that I did pick up from the auto parts store. And when I go to do this, I try to make sure that the seal is going into the hub somewhat evenly. So I don't like to just tap on it with a hammer on one side and then another. I like to grab something like this, it's just a board that I had laying around. Make sure it's clean so you're not dropping crap into there. And make sure that it spans both sides of your seal so that when you're tapping the seal in, it goes in evenly around. Now that the grease seal's in, you just want to take your finger, run it around the edge, and make sure that it's flush against all sides and that there's not any parts of it that are slightly higher than another side. With the new seal installed on the back side, we're ready to reverse the process and put it all back together. One thing to note, you want to try not to get grease on the inside of the hub here. This is where your brake shoes run. So if that's all lubed up with grease, you're just not going to stop that well. Before I slide the hub back onto the axle, I'm just going to clean the axle up. It's got a lot of old grease on there, along with some stuff that's now been blowing around. So I want it to be completely clean and free of debris, and inspect it at the same time, make sure there's nothing abnormal about it before I slide everything back on and put it back together. So before sliding the hub back on, I want to make sure that I don't jam the axle into the back of the hub or onto the seal or into the bearings. So just try to get it on there as straight as you can. I have my bearing already installed on the front. You could leave that out if you wanted to while putting it on, but I've installed it on there and packed it with grease. It shouldn't go anywhere as long as I'm putting it on straight. Now that the hub is back on, I'm ready to install my castle nut. And one thing you want to make sure is that you do have the washer installed that goes between this nut and the bearing. I've got my castle nut installed and I've only gone hand tight with it. This is kind of an important step. This isn't a classic nut and bolt situation. You don't want to reef on this and tighten it all the way down or your hub's not going to spin. You also don't want to have it over tightened. What I like to do is get it a little bit snug where I have a little bit of resistance on it, and then I'll back it off just a hair, and then I'm going to spin it, make sure that it spins freely and that it has a few revolutions out of it before it comes to a stop. If you spin it and you let go and it stops right away, you're a little too tight on this nut on the outside. Also, I'm going to grab both sides and I'm going to wiggle it back and forth and check for any play. If you have an abnormal amount of play, then this is too loose. So I like to get it to where I don't have any play in there and I still can spin this freely. Now if you go to insert your pin back in here and things don't line up right, you don't want to go and tighten it anymore. Back it off just a hair until you can get your pin in. If you over tighten it, that's a bad situation. So loosen it to find that pinhole if it doesn't exactly line up. So I'm now ready to insert my pin back into the nut so that it doesn't move once I put everything back together. With my pin installed, I'm ready to go ahead and put the wheel back on. With this, I like to just slide it on and then put my nuts on while it's still up in the air. I like to get it as tight as I can, but remember, this is going to be spinning freely. So once I get it as tight as I can, then I'll lower everything back to the ground and get my final torque on all of the nuts. I've reinstalled my wheel, torqued down all of my lug nuts, and I've put this dust seal back on. The dust seal is something I just set up against the hub and I just tapped it on with a hammer. Easy enough. One thing I'm going to do is after I drive maybe 20 or 30 miles on this wheel, I'm going to recheck all of my lug nuts and make sure they're still tight. That's something I do anytime I remove a wheel on a trailer. After I drive a little ways, I just recheck everything, make sure it's all still torqued. Hopefully you guys found this video somewhat helpful. I'm now full of brake dust. I've got some grease on my t-shirt, and I've successfully gone through, about half a roll of paper towels. So hopefully you guys are cleaner and have more paper towels left than I do. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them below. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching. I'm Tyson with Adventure Rig.